Hi, thanks for joining me. Today I'm going to discuss the state of our species, the humans, as outlined by Charles C. Mann in his article, The State of the Species, in the book Global Environmental Politics. And Mann is a prolific writer. He writes for Science, Atlantic, Wired, New York Times, Smithsonian, Washington Post, etc., etc. Written lots of books, and now he gives his insight on the state of and fate of the human species. And I will warn you up front, it doesn't look good. Um, so he draws uh, primarily on the research of Lynn Margulis. She works with bacteria and uh, kind of what happens with a species that's not constrained by competition from other species towards resources. And so she gives an example of a famous experiment where bacteria are put into a petri dish with some wheat, which the bacteria love, um, and they follow a specific population curve where at first there's only a few of them. They hit an inflection point. They start multiplying like crazy exponentially until the food becomes limited because they're in a petri dish. Population levels out, and then they start dying off until there's none left. So she describes this um, with bacteria and what she calls successful species. Right, it doesn't have any competitors competing for food. Um, and what Mann concludes is basically this is what's happening with humans. Just an interesting fact here is that there that he gives is that there are 10 times the amount of bacterial cells in our bodies than there are actual human cells. Um, and really, he's just applying this to the fate of humans here, because actually bacteria are constrained in this ecosystem, and they will probably be okay. Um, so how's this going to work? Well, basically, um, our petri dish, he explains, is the Earth, right? We have limited resources, right? Maybe we could find other planets more to live on, more resources, but let's just say this is actually pretty small, short time scale that we're talking about this happening in here. Um, so our resource, our petri dish, is the Earth. Um, and so how did our growth start? Well, initially it said that when we migrated from Africa, uh, there were only actually a couple hundred people that migrated, and they wandered off into these lands that were so lush and filled with life, and they would just, pick apples and be eating. They had um, plenty to eat for a while, um, and basically, it was we lived in a sustainable way at this low, extremely low population in the world. More recently, about 10,000 years ago, he's saying there were about 5 million people um, in the world, and that's when we started to hit our first inflection point, and we started developing agriculture. And as soon as we did that, our population began to boom, um, and I mean, nowhere at the point. I mean, it was a slower boom, um, but really only in the past, couple hundred years, it's been this extreme boom. And it said now we use about 50% of land's biological production, and about half of fresh water was consumed by humans. This was done by a Stanford study um, famous Stanford study. Anyway, it's estimated that by 2050 there'll be about 10 billion humans. That's about 3 billion more than today. So you can see this is kind of the petri dish filling itself up, consuming resources. And what Mann says here that's really interesting is that he links it to the problem is further catalyzed by all of the uh, nations and people that are rising out of poverty. So there are, billions of people in the world who are eating just like basic grains and really basic things just for survival. And as they rise, as they get a little bit more cash, they want all the things that wealthier people have. They want to eat meat specifically, he says, and consume and consume and consume more. Um, the the biggest impact, according to man, is really on the meat consumption. Right now, we use 35% of grain that's produced in the world goes to feeding livestock so that people can eat meat. Um, this is an unsustainable amount of grain to be used for feeding livestock. Um, if more and more and more people want to be eating meat. And what he estimates is that we would need to produce about 40% more grain by 2050 than today. That's like, if we're on track, we have to do that to feed ourselves as a species. So that seems like we're trying to come up with new ways to deal with a full petri dish on the planet as we use up all the resources. So there's kind of a couple options. One is to slow ourselves down, and the other one is to scientifically improve ourselves and our crops. GMO, bloody bloody bloody, to be able to feed so many people. Um, Both of these things come with huge negative repercussions, and for the option to slow ourselves down from consumption, stepping away from the industrial agriculture, what he says is it's a really strange problem because no species has ever done this before. If there's ever a runaway species that doesn't um, fall within the competitive landscape, um, they don't slow themselves down. Zebra mussels in the Great Lakes, rabbits in Australia, given no constraints, they will eat and eat and eat and eat and destroy and destroy and destroy everything around them to populate and to reproduce and to make more of themselves. That's just what happens. And so are the question is, are humans able to be that first species who can implement control of resource use? That would be awesome. Um, However, he doesn't really think it's possible because what he says, he uses a term called discount rate, which is given by which is an economic term which basically says, um, you ask a kid, or an adult, would you rather have one apple today or two apples tomorrow? And most people will take the apple today, right? People care about their um, immediate results that immediately impact them. I mean, this is obvious. It's um, people. He says, he gives the example of like people care more about fixing the stoplight down the street than if 50,000 people die of Ebola or whatever it is. And so And he says rightfully so, because you're more likely to be killed because of that stoplight than by something far away that's not immediately affecting you. Um, but basically, he concludes that humans probably won't be able to get past this discount rate to slow ourselves down. Um, so, in the answer to the question, are we doomed to destroy ourselves like the bacteria? He ends the chapter in saying, he says, whether we're doomed to destroy ourselves, the answer to the question of whether we're doomed to destroy ourselves is yes. It should be obvious. But then he says, italicized, should be, but perhaps is not. So he's offering a little bit of hope, but he doesn't say what it is. And kind of the biggest problem here, if we do destroy ourselves, not the biggest, but a pretty severe problem, is that along with destroying ourselves, we'll be taking down all mammals and most animals, many plants, and that is a real consequence of this curve. So that's man's outlook on the state of the species, and he does end on a note of hope. However, it seems like he really thinks we need to take a large leap forward, and he doesn't really know. He doesn't give any answers, and he doesn't really know how. So that's the current state of our species, and maybe the task of our time is really to come up with some. This brings up so many questions as to solutions, ethics, specifically regarding GMOs, and how those affect us and the planet, and human manipulation of the planet. These are all really important questions because we do need to figure out a way to feed ourselves, for our own sake and for the sake of all of the other animals and plants on this planet.